Forget Johnny Depp with perfect teeth and a bottle of rum. Forget treasure maps and dramatic sword fights under the moonlight. We are talking about real pirates. The ones who smelled like death, rarely bathed, and spent most of their time either bored out of their minds or sick with something that would probably kill them. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this if you enjoy learning about history's ugly truths. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now settle in. Maybe grab a drink that is not full of weevils, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you just signed up to be a pirate. Maybe you were tricked. Maybe you were desperate. Maybe you thought it sounded exciting. Whatever the reason, you have made a terrible mistake. Your new life is not going to be about treasure and adventure. It is going to be about waiting, rotting, and trying not to die from something completely preventable. Let us start with the basics. You are now on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean. The year is around 1700. You are surrounded by about 70 to 100 other men, all packed together like sardines in a can. Most pirate ships during the golden age of piracy, which lasted from about 1650 to 1730, carried between 50 and 100 crew members. Some of the bigger ships, like Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, had up to 300 men crammed aboard. But most pirates sailed on smaller sloops or brigantines with much smaller crews. Your ship is not clean, it is not comfortable, and it definitely does not smell good. In fact, the smell is probably the first thing that hits you. It is a mix of unwashed bodies, rotting food, tar, gunpowder, and human waste. There is no soap. There is no deodorant. There is barely any fresh water. You are stuck in this floating prison with nowhere to go and nothing to do most of the time. Welcome to pirate life. It only gets worse from here. So where do you sleep on a pirate ship? The answer is anywhere you can find space. And that space is not going to be comfortable. Most ordinary crew members slept below deck in the cramped, dark, damp areas of the ship. There were no beds, no mattresses, no pillows. You got a hammock if you were lucky. And hammocks were actually considered a luxury because they kept you off the wet floor and away from the rats. But here is the thing. Not everyone got a hammock. Space was limited. So many pirates just slept on the deck, on piles of old rope, or on their own coats. Some just curled up on the bare wooden planks and hoped they would not roll over in their sleep and fall into the bilge water they collected at the bottom of the ship. The bilge was basically a layer of disgusting water that sat at the very bottom of the ship. It was a mix of seawater that leaked through the wooden planks, urine, vomit, rotting food, dead rats, and anything else that dripped down through the deck. It smelled absolutely horrible, and it was a breeding ground for disease. Ships had to be pumped out regularly, or the bilge would rise and flood the lower decks. But even when it was pumped, the smell never went away. Your sleeping area was dark. Ships did not have electric lights, obviously. They had candles and oil lamps, but using fire below deck was incredibly dangerous because of all the wood and tar. So most of the time, you were sleeping in total darkness. The only light came from small openings in the deck above you, and even that was dim. You could not see your hand in front of your face most of the time. And then there were the rats. Ships were absolutely crawling with them. Rats came aboard when the ship was in port, hiding in barrels of food and supplies. Once they were on the ship, they bred like crazy. Some ships had hundreds of rats running around at night. They chewed through ropes, ate the food stores, and even bit sleeping sailors. There are documented cases of sailors waking up with rat bites on their faces and hands. And rats carried diseases like plague and typhus, so sleeping near them was a health hazard. The temperature below deck was also miserable. If you were sailing in the Caribbean, which many pirates did, it was hot and humid. The air below deck was thick and hard to breathe. There was no ventilation, no fans, no way to cool down. You would wake up drenched in sweat, covered in salt from the sea air, and probably covered in bug bites too. And if you were sailing in colder waters, like the North Atlantic, it was freezing. You had one set of clothes and maybe a coat if you were lucky. But those clothes were damp from the sea spray and never fully dried. Sleeping in wet clothes in a cold ship was a good way to get sick. Pneumonia and hypothermia killed plenty of sailors, pirates included. Privacy? Forget it. You were packed in with dozens of other men. Everyone could hear you snore, cough, fart, and moan in your sleep. There were no walls, no curtains, no personal space. If you had a nightmare and woke up screaming, everyone knew about it. This was your bedroom, and you would be sleeping here for weeks, sometimes months at a time, without ever setting foot on land. Now that you have woken up in your dark, damp, rat-infested sleeping area, it is time to eat. And let me tell you, the food on a pirate ship was absolutely disgusting. Forget about fresh vegetables. Forget about fresh meat. Forget about anything that tastes good. You are about to eat the worst meals of your entire life, and you are going to eat them every single day for months. The main food on most pirate ships was something called hardtack. Hardtack was a type of biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. That is it. No butter, no sugar, no flavor. It was baked until it was rock hard, so it would not spoil. And when I say rock hard, I mean it could break your teeth. Sailors often had to soak hardtack in water or grog, which was watered down rum, just to make it soft enough to chew. Even then, it was like eating salty cardboard. But the worst part about hardtack was not the taste. It was the bugs. Hardtack was infested with weevils, which are small beetles that burrowed into the biscuits and laid eggs. When you bit into hardtack, you were also biting into weevils and their larvae. Some sailors would tap the biscuits on the table before eating them to knock the bugs out. Others just ate them anyway because they needed the calories. Protein is protein, right? Salted meat was another staple. This was usually pork or beef that had been preserved in barrels of salt. The salt kept the meat from rotting too quickly, but it also made it incredibly tough and salty. The meat was often so hard that sailors nicknamed it salt horse because it was tough enough to be horse meat. And honestly, it probably was horse meat sometimes. No one was checking. You would have to boil it for hours just to make it chewable. And even then, it tasted terrible. Ships also carried dried peas and beans. These were cooked into a thick stew that sailors called lobscouse or burgoo. It was basically a gloppy mess of peas, beans, and whatever meat scraps were available, all boiled together in seawater. Sometimes they added hardtack crumbs to thicken it. It was not delicious, but it was filling, and that was all that mattered. You ate it because you had to, not because you wanted to. Fresh food was almost impossible to keep. There were no refrigerators, no ice, no way to preserve anything. If a ship managed to steal some chickens or goats from a raid, they would keep them alive on deck and kill them one at a time for fresh meat. But those animals did not last long, and once they were gone, you were back to hardtack and salt horse. Fruits and vegetables rotted quickly. Potatoes, onions, and cabbages might last a few weeks if stored properly. But after that, they turned into moldy, slimy mush. And that is when scurvy started to become a problem. Scurvy is a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. Without fresh fruits and vegetables, sailors would develop scurvy after just a few months at sea. The symptoms of scurvy were horrible. It started with fatigue and weakness, and your gums would start to bleed, and your teeth would fall out. Your skin would bruise easily, and old wounds would reopen. In the final stages, you would start bleeding internally, and eventually die. Scurvy killed more sailors during the Age of Sail than battles and storms combined. It was a slow, painful death, and it was completely preventable if you just ate some citrus fruit. But most pirate ships did not carry lemons or limes because they rotted too fast. The British Navy eventually figured out that citrus prevented scurvy, which is why British sailors were called limeys. But that knowledge did not really spread to pirate ships. Pirates were too busy stealing rum and gold to worry about proper nutrition, so scurvy was just part of life. You hoped you would not get it, and if you did, you hoped you would die quickly. Drinking water on a ship was also a problem. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels, but it did not stay fresh for long. After a few weeks, it would turn green and slimy with algae. It tasted terrible and smelled worse. Sailors called it scummy water. You still had to drink it because you needed water to survive. But it often made you sick. Dysentery and cholera were common because the water was contaminated with bacteria. That is why sailors drank alcohol instead. Beer, wine, and rum did not spoil as easily as water, and the alcohol killed some of the bacteria. Grog, which was rum mixed with water, was the drink of choice for many sailors. It was safer than straight water, and it helped take the edge off the misery of life at sea. But drinking grog all day every day also meant that a lot of pirates were at least slightly drunk most of the time. Not enough to be useless, but enough to dull the pain of their terrible lives. So to recap, your meals as a pirate consisted of bug-infested biscuits, rock-hard salted meat, bland pea stew, and water that tasted like pond scum. You washed it all down with watered-down rum, and you ate the same menu every single day for months. No variety, no flavor, no joy, just survival. Enjoy your breakfast. so you have eaten your weevil-filled breakfast. Now nature is calling, and this is where things get really unpleasant. Using the bathroom on a pirate ship was not a private or dignified experience. In fact, it was one of the worst parts of daily life at sea. Pirates did not have toilets. They had something called the head. The head was a plank with a hole cut in it that stuck out over the front of the ship near the bow. You would climb out onto this plank, hang your backside over the edge, and do your business directly into the ocean. No privacy, no toilet paper, no walls, just you, the open air, and the waves below. The reason it was called the head was because it was located at the head or front of the ship. This location was chosen for practical reasons. The front of the ship was where the waves crashed the hardest, so the seawater would wash away the waste. Also, the wind usually blew from the front of the ship to the back, so the smell would blow away from the rest of the crew. In theory, anyway. In practice, the smell still lingered. Using the head was dangerous. You had to climb out onto a narrow plank that was slippery from sea spray. The ship was constantly rocking back and forth. If you lost your balance, you could fall into the ocean. And if you fell into the ocean, especially at night, you were probably not getting rescued. The ship would not stop for you, so you had to hold on tight and hope you did not slip. Toilet paper did not exist in the 1700s. So what did pirates use instead? Most used old ropes. Ships had plenty of frayed rope ends lying around, and these were used to wipe. The rope ends were soaked in seawater to clean them, then hung up to dry for the next person. Yes, you read that right. Pirates shared the same communal rope for wiping. It was disgusting, and it was also incredibly rough on your skin. Rope burn is bad enough on your hands. Imagine it on your backside. Some sailors used torn pieces of old cloth or canvas if they could find it. Others just used their hands and washed them in the ocean afterward. There was no soap, so the cleaning was not very effective. This is why diseases spread so easily on ships. Everyone was touching everything with dirty hands, and there was no way to truly get clean. During storms, using the head was even worse. The waves would crash over the bow and drench you while you were trying to do your business. The plank would be even more slippery, and the ship would be rocking so violently that you could barely keep your balance. Many sailors just gave up and used a bucket below deck during storms. But then someone had to empty that bucket overboard later, and that job usually went to the newest or lowest ranking crew member. At night, going to the head was especially miserable. It was dark. There were no lights on the front of the ship. You had to feel your way along the deck, climb out onto the plank, and hope you did not fall. Many pirates just avoided eating or drinking too much before bed, so they would not have to make the journey in the dark. And let us not forget about seasickness. If you got seasick, which many sailors did, especially in rough waters, you would be vomiting over the side of the ship constantly. There was no medicine for seasickness. You just had to suffer through it. Some sailors never got over it and spent their entire time at sea feeling nauseous. Imagine having to use the head while also feeling like you are about to throw up. It was miserable. So to sum it up, Using the bathroom on a pirate ship was dangerous, uncomfortable, unsanitary, and completely lacking in privacy. You risked falling into the ocean every time you went. You had no toilet paper. You shared a rope with dozens of other men. And you did all of this while the ship rocked back and forth in the waves. It is hard to imagine anything less glamorous. But this was just a normal part of daily life for pirates. Now let us talk about what you are wearing. If you think pirates had fancy coats and feathered hats, you are going to be disappointed. Real pirates dressed like the working-class sailors they were, and their clothes were in terrible condition most of the time. Most pirates wore simple shirts made of linen or cotton, loose-fitting trousers, and a jacket or coat if they had one. These clothes were designed to be practical for working on a ship. They needed to be loose enough to move in, but tough enough to withstand the wear and tear of daily labor. The problem was that clothes did not last long at sea. Everything was constantly damp from the sea spray. Salt water is incredibly corrosive. It ate away at fabric, turning it stiff and brittle. After a few weeks at sea, your clothes would be crusted with salt. They would chafe against your skin and cause painful rashes, and there was no way to wash them properly. Fresh water was too valuable to waste on laundry, so you just wore the same clothes day after day, letting them get dirtier and more tattered. Pirates did not have closets full of clothes. Most men owned exactly one set of clothing, maybe two if they were lucky. If your shirt tore, you patched it with whatever scraps of fabric you could find. If your trousers wore out, you sewed them back together with needle and thread. There were no stores to buy new clothes. You had to make do with what you had. And if your clothes fell apart completely, you were out of luck. Shoes were another problem. Good shoes were expensive and hard to come by. Most pirates wore simple leather shoes or boots, but leather did not hold up well in seawater. It would crack, split, and fall apart after a few months. Many sailors just went barefoot. Walking barefoot on a wooden deck full of splinters, nails, and tar was painful. But it was better than wearing shoes that were falling apart. The sun was also brutal on clothing. If you were sailing in the Caribbean, the sun beat down on you relentlessly. The UV rays faded colors and weakened fabric fibers. Combined with the salt water and constant wear, your clothes would disintegrate surprisingly quickly. A shirt that was whole when you left port might be little more than rags a few months later. Hats were important because they protected your head from the sun. Pirates often wore simple tricorn hats, bandanas, or wide-brimmed hats. These helped prevent sunburn and heat stroke. But hats also wore out quickly. The salt spray and sun would ruin them. So pirates would tie a cloth around their head instead, which was cheaper and easier to replace. There were no washing machines, no dryers, no laundry detergent. If you wanted to wash your clothes, you had to do it by hand in a bucket of seawater. Seawater does not clean very well because of the salt. It just makes things stiff. So most pirates did not bother. They just wore the same dirty clothes until they literally fell apart. The smell was unimaginable. Body odor was a constant issue. With no soap and no fresh water for bathing, everyone smelled terrible. Your clothes soaked up sweat, salt, and grime. After a few weeks, your shirt would be so stiff with dried sweat and salt that it could practically stand up on its own. And you would just keep wearing it because you had no other choice. Lice and fleas were also a huge problem. These tiny parasites lived in your clothes and hair and fed on your blood. They caused intense itching and could spread diseases like typhus. Everyone on the ship had lice. It was impossible to get rid of them. You could pick them out of your hair and crush them, but they would always come back. At night, you would feel them crawling on your skin. It was maddening. So the image of the stylish pirate with the fancy coat and the plumed hat is mostly fiction. Real pirates wore whatever rags they could scrounge up. Their clothes were dirty, torn, covered in salt, and infested with bugs. They smelled like sweat and seawater, and they wore the same outfit for months at a time without washing it. Fashion was not a priority when you were just trying to survive. Here is something that pirate movies never show you. The boredom. Most of a pirate's life was spent waiting. Waiting for wind. Waiting for a ship to attack. Waiting for storms to pass. Waiting for orders. Piracy was not constant action and adventure. It was long stretches of absolutely nothing happening. Ships moved slowly, very slowly. A typical sailing ship in the 1700s could travel about 100 miles per day if the wind was good. But the wind was not always good. Sometimes the wind died completely, and the ship would sit dead in the water for days at a time. This was called being becalmed, and it was one of the most frustrating things that could happen. When the ship was becalmed, there was nothing to do. The sails hung limp. The ship did not move. You just sat there, baking in the sun, waiting for the wind to pick up. This could last for days or even weeks. During this time, water and food rations would be cut to make supplies last longer. So you would be hot, hungry, thirsty, and bored out of your mind. Even when the ship was moving, there was not much to do most of the time. Yes, there were chores. Ropes needed to be repaired. The deck needed to be swabbed. The sails needed to be adjusted. But these tasks did not take all day. Once the work was done, you were left with hours of empty time. Pirates did not have phones, books, or any form of entertainment we would recognize today. Most pirates could not read, so books were useless to them anyway. There were no games except for dice and cards, and even those got old after playing them 1,000 times. Some pirates carved wood or made rope knots to pass the time. Others just sat around and talked. But after weeks at sea with the same people, you ran out of things to say. Drinking was a common way to pass the time. As mentioned earlier, pirates drank a lot of rum and grog. Getting drunk helped make the boredom more bearable, but it also led to fights. When you stick a bunch of armed, drunk men in a confined space with nothing to do, tensions run high. Arguments would break out over stupid things. Card games would turn violent. Someone would insult someone else, and suddenly there would be a fist fight on deck. Music was one of the few forms of entertainment. Some pirates played instruments like fiddles, accordions, or tin whistles. They would play sea shanties, which were work songs that helped pass the time during repetitive tasks like hauling ropes. Singing together was one of the few ways to feel connected to your crew and break up the monotony. But even that got old after singing the same songs over and over. Then there were the superstitions. Sailors were incredibly superstitious. They believed in all kinds of omens and bad luck. Whistling on a ship was considered bad luck because it could summon a storm. Killing an albatross was bad luck. Starting a voyage on a Friday was bad luck. Women on a ship were bad luck. Black cats, red-headed people, and even saying certain words out loud were all considered unlucky. These superstitions were taken very seriously. If something bad happened, like a storm or a failed attack, the crew would look for someone or something to blame. Maybe someone had whistled. Maybe someone had brought bad luck aboard, and that person would be punished. Superstitions gave sailors a sense of control in a world where they had very little control over anything. Days blended together. Without clocks or calendars, it was hard to keep track of time. Every day was the same. Wake up, eat hardtack, do some work, sit around, eat more hardtack, go to sleep, repeat. The only break in the routine was when a ship was spotted on the horizon. Then suddenly, everyone would snap to attention. The boredom would vanish and be replaced by adrenaline. But those moments were rare. Actual pirate attacks were few and far between. You could sail for weeks or months without seeing another ship. And even when you did see a ship, it might be too fast to catch or too well armed to attack. Or it might be a pirate ship like yours, and pirates generally did not attack each other unless there was a good reason. When an attack did happen, it was over quickly. Most merchant ships surrendered without a fight because they knew they would be outgunned. Pirates would board the ship, take whatever cargo and valuables they could find, maybe recruit some of the sailors to join their crew, and then sail away. The whole thing might take a few hours at most. Then it was back to the endless waiting. So the life of a pirate was not a constant thrill ride. It was mostly boring. Mind-numbingly boring. You spent most of your time sitting on a ship with nothing to do, surrounded by the same smelly, drunk, angry men, eating terrible food and drinking questionable water. The excitement of an attack was a brief interruption in an otherwise monotonous existence. And that boredom, combined with the terrible living conditions, is what made piracy such a miserable way to live. If the boredom did not drive you crazy, the diseases probably would, or they would just kill you. Ships were floating death traps when it came to illness. With no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, and no proper sanitation, diseases spread like wildfire. And once you got sick, your chances of survival were not good. We already talked about scurvy, which was caused by a lack of vitamin C, but scurvy was just one of many diseases that plagued sailors. Let us talk about some of the others. Dysentery was one of the most common and deadly diseases on ships. It was caused by contaminated food and water. The symptoms were severe diarrhea, stomach cramps, fever, and dehydration. In the 1700s, there was no way to treat it. You just had to ride it out and hope you did not die. Many sailors did die because the constant diarrhea would dehydrate them so badly that their organs would shut down. And with limited fresh water on board, there was no way to rehydrate properly. Dysentery spread easily on ships because of the terrible sanitary conditions. Remember the communal rope used for wiping at the head? That was a perfect way to spread bacteria. One person with dysentery could infect the entire crew in a matter of days. And once an outbreak started, it was almost impossible to stop. Typhus was another killer. It was spread by lice, which, as we discussed, everyone on the ship had. Typhus caused high fever, headaches, rashes, and delirium. It killed about 20% of the people who got it, and there was no cure. You either survived or you did not. The only way to prevent typhus was to get rid of the lice. But that was impossible on a ship where no one bathed and everyone wore the same clothes for months. Yellow fever was a major problem in tropical areas like the Caribbean, where many pirates operated. It was spread by mosquitoes. The symptoms were fever, chills, vomiting, and jaundice, which is when your skin turns yellow. About half of the people who got yellow fever died from it. There was no treatment. You just had to hope you were one of the lucky ones who survived. Malaria was also spread by mosquitoes and was common in tropical regions. It caused recurring fevers, chills, and sweating. While malaria was not always fatal, it weakened you significantly. And if you got it multiple times, which many sailors did, it could eventually kill you. There was no cure for malaria in the 1700s. Some people used quinine, which came from tree bark, and it did help. But it was expensive and hard to get. Gangrene was a constant threat. Any small cut or injury could become infected. And without antibiotics, infections were deadly. If you cut your hand while working and it got infected, the infection could spread up your arm. The flesh would turn black and rot. The smell was horrible. The only treatment was amputation. A ship's surgeon, if there even was one, would cut off the infected limb with a saw. No anesthesia. Just rum to dull the pain and a leather strap to bite down on. Many men died from the shock or blood loss. And even if you survived, you were now disabled and unable to work as effectively. Tuberculosis, also called consumption, was another common disease. It spread easily in the cramped, poorly ventilated spaces below deck. TB caused a chronic cough, bloody sputum, weight loss, and eventually death. It was a slow disease that could take years to kill you. But once you had it, you were basically doomed. There was no cure. You just wasted away slowly. Then there were the venereal diseases. Pirates frequently visited ports and brothels. And in the days before condoms and antibiotics, sexually transmitted infections like syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant. Syphilis in particular was a terrible disease. It started with sores, then progressed to rashes, fevers, and eventually insanity and death. It could take years to kill you, but it was always fatal without treatment. And treatment in the 1700s meant taking mercury, which was also poisonous and often killed patients faster than the disease itself. Dental problems were also a major issue. With no dentists and a diet of hard, sugary foods like hardtack and rum, teeth rotted quickly. Tooth decay was extremely painful and could lead to abscesses. An abscessed tooth could cause an infection that spread to your jaw and skull. This could kill you. The only treatment was to pull the tooth out with pliers. Again, no anesthesia, just alcohol and willpower. So to sum it up, if you were a pirate, you were constantly at risk of dying from disease. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, yellow fever, malaria, gangrene, tuberculosis, syphilis, and dental infections were all common. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no real medical care. You just got sick and hoped you survived. Most did not. Disease killed far more pirates than battles ever did. Imagine living in a space the size of a small apartment with 100 other people. Now imagine you can never leave. You eat together. You sleep together. You work together. You use the bathroom in front of each other. There is nowhere to go to be alone. Ever. This was life on a pirate ship. Privacy was not a concept that existed on ships. There were no private rooms, no doors you could close, no walls that separated you from everyone else. You were constantly surrounded by people, and these were not people you chose to be around. They were whoever happened to sign up for the same ship as you. Some of them you might get along with. Many of them you probably did not. Everyone knew everyone's business. If you had a bad day, everyone knew about it. If you were sick, everyone could hear you vomiting. If you had a nightmare, everyone heard you scream. There were no secrets on a ship. Everything you did was observed by dozens of other men. This lack of privacy extended to bodily functions. As we discussed, using the head was a public affair. But even things like changing clothes or scratching an itch were done in full view of everyone else. There was nowhere to go to have a moment alone. You could not step outside for some fresh air and solitude. You were already outside, and you were never alone. The psychological toll of this was enormous. Humans need privacy. We need time alone to decompress and process our thoughts. Being constantly surrounded by people, especially in stressful conditions, is mentally exhausting. It leads to irritability, anxiety, and aggression. And on a ship full of armed men with nothing to do, that aggression could quickly turn violent. Fights were common. Tensions would build up over weeks of being crammed together. Then something small would set someone off. Maybe someone ate more than their share of food. Maybe someone made a joke that went too far. Maybe someone just looked at someone wrong, and suddenly fists were flying. Sometimes knives were drawn. The captain or quartermaster would have to break up the fight and dole out punishment. Punishments on pirate ships were harsh. Pirates are often portrayed as having democratic systems where everyone had a say. And it is true that pirate crews voted on major decisions. But that does not mean there were no rules or punishments. If you broke the rules, you faced consequences. And those consequences were brutal. One common punishment was flogging. You would be tied to the mast and whipped with a cat of 9 tails, which was a whip with 9 knotted cords. Each strike tore open your skin. After a few dozen lashes, your back would be a bloody mess. This was done in front of the entire crew as a warning to others. Then you were expected to get back to work the next day with your back still raw and infected. Marooning was another punishment. If you committed a serious offense, like stealing from the crew or deserting, you could be marooned. This meant being left alone on a deserted island or beach with no food, no water, and no way to escape. You were given a pistol with 1 bullet, supposedly so you could defend yourself or end your suffering. But really, marooning was a death sentence. Very few people survived it. Walking the plank is a famous pirate punishment, but it probably was not as common as movies suggest. Most pirates just threw people overboard if they wanted to kill them. But either way, being forced into the ocean in the middle of nowhere meant certain death. You would drown within minutes. Or sharks would get you. Or you would die of exposure. There was no coming back from that. So the lack of privacy and personal space created a pressure cooker environment. Men were constantly on edge. They snapped at each other over nothing. And the punishments for stepping out of line were severe. This made life on a pirate ship not just uncomfortable, but psychologically damaging. You could not escape. You could not get away from people who annoyed you. You just had to endure it, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. The only real escape was going ashore. But that did not happen often. Pirates would spend weeks or months at sea between port visits. And when they did go ashore, it was usually just to resupply, repair the ship, or spend their money on alcohol and prostitutes. Then it was back to the ship and back to the same cramped, crowded, miserable existence. So if you thought being a pirate meant freedom and adventure, think again. It meant being trapped on a ship with dozens of other men, with no privacy, no personal space, and no escape. It meant dealing with constant tension and the threat of violence. And it meant enduring this for months at a time with no relief. Freedom was an illusion. You were just trading one prison for another. Let us talk about the part of piracy that actually was exciting. The attacks, the fighting, the violence. Except exciting is the wrong word. Terrifying is more accurate. And brutal. And bloody. When pirates attacked a ship, it was not a choreographed sword fight with dramatic music playing in the background. It was chaos, screaming, and death. First, you need to understand how pirate attacks actually worked. Pirates did not just randomly sail around looking for any ship to attack. They were strategic. They looked for merchant ships that were slow, poorly defended, and carrying valuable cargo. They avoided warships because warships had cannons and trained soldiers who would fight back. Pirates wanted easy targets, not suicide missions. When a pirate ship spotted a potential target, they would raise a flag to identify themselves. Sometimes they flew a false flag, pretending to be a merchant ship or a friendly vessel. This would let them get close before revealing their true intentions. Once they were close enough, they would raise their real flag, the pirate flag. The Jolly Roger. The Jolly Roger was not just one design. Different pirate captains had different flags. Some showed a skull and crossbones. Others showed a skeleton holding an hourglass, which meant your time was running out. Some showed a heart dripping blood. The point of these flags was psychological warfare. They were meant to terrify the crew of the merchant ship into surrendering without a fight. And it often worked. Most merchant sailors were not fighters. They were regular working men who just wanted to transport cargo and get paid. They did not want to die for someone else's goods. So when they saw a pirate flag, they usually surrendered immediately. The pirates would board the ship, take what they wanted, and leave. No one had to die. But sometimes the merchant ship decided to fight back. Maybe they had valuable cargo worth defending. Maybe the captain was stubborn. Maybe they thought they could win. Whatever the reason, this is when things got bloody. Pirates used cannons first. They would fire at the merchant ship to damage the rigging and sails, trying to slow it down or stop it completely. Cannonballs were made of iron and weighed anywhere from 6 to 32 pounds. When one of these hit a wooden ship, it would smash through the hull, sending splinters flying everywhere. These splinters were deadly. A piece of wood flying at high speed could impale you just as easily as a cannonball could. Pirates also used chain shot and bar shot. These were special types of ammunition designed to destroy sails and rigging. Chain shot was 2 cannonballs connected by a chain. When fired, it would spin through the air and tear through sails and ropes. Bar shot was similar, but used an iron bar instead of a chain. These weapons were incredibly effective at disabling a ship without sinking it, which is what pirates wanted. A sunken ship had no cargo to steal. Once the merchant ship was disabled, the pirates would pull alongside and board it. This is where hand-to-hand combat happened. Pirates carried a variety of weapons. Cutlasses, which were short curved swords, were popular because they were easy to use in close quarters. Pistols were common, but not very reliable. They were single-shot weapons that took a long time to reload. So you got one shot, and then the pistol became a club. Axes, daggers, and even belaying pins, which were wooden clubs used for tying ropes, were all used as weapons. Fighting on a ship was messy and cramped. There was no room for fancy sword work. You just swung and stabbed and hoped you hit the other guy before he hit you. Injuries from these fights were horrific. Sword cuts could slice through muscle and bone. An axe to the head would split your skull open. A pistol ball to the chest would punch through your ribs and tear apart your internal organs. And remember, there were no hospitals. No surgeons who actually knew what they were doing. If you got seriously injured in a fight, you were probably going to die. Even minor injuries could be fatal. A cut on your arm might seem like nothing, but without antibiotics, that cut could get infected. The infection could spread. Gangrene could set in, and then your arm would have to be amputated or you would die. This is why pirates were actually very motivated to avoid fighting when possible. They knew that even winning a battle could mean death from infection days or weeks later. Pirates also had a reputation for torture and cruelty, and some of that reputation was deserved. If a merchant captain tried to hide cargo or refused to cooperate, pirates would torture him to get information. Methods included beating, burning, cutting, and other things too graphic to describe in detail. The goal was to terrify the captain into talking, and it usually worked. But here's the thing. Pirates were not mindlessly cruel. They were cruel for a reason. Their reputation for violence was actually a business strategy. The more terrifying their reputation, the more likely merchant ships were to surrender without a fight. If everyone knew that resisting pirates meant torture and death, then no one would resist. It was psychological warfare. Fear was a weapon just as much as swords and cannons. That said, some pirates were genuinely sadistic. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, cultivated an image of being absolutely terrifying. He would weave slow-burning fuses into his beard and light them during battles so his face would be surrounded by smoke. He wanted to look like a demon, and it worked. Most ships surrendered to him immediately. Charles Vane was known for his cruelty and violence. He tortured prisoners and killed captives even after they surrendered. Edward Lowe was another particularly brutal pirate. He once cut off a man's lips, cooked them, and made the man eat them. These stories spread and added to the terrifying reputation of pirates in general. But for every brutal pirate like Lowe or Vane, there were many more who just wanted to get the job done with minimal bloodshed. Fighting was dangerous and expensive. Cannonballs cost money. Gunpowder cost money. Injured crew members could not work. Dead crew members had to be replaced. So most pirates preferred to use fear and intimidation to get what they wanted rather than actual violence. Still, when violence did happen, it was brutal and traumatizing. You would see men cut down in front of you. Blood would be everywhere. The screaming would be deafening. And after the fight was over, you would have to help throw the bodies overboard and scrub the blood off the deck. There was no time to process what you had just experienced. You just had to keep going. So yes, pirate attacks could be exciting in the worst possible way. But they were rare, and they were terrifying. And they could get you killed or horribly injured. Most pirates were not looking for fights. They were looking for easy money. The violence was just an unfortunate part of the job. And it left physical and psychological scars that never fully healed. If the diseases and violence did not kill you, the ocean probably would. The ocean is terrifying. It is vast, unpredictable, and completely indifferent to whether you live or die. And in a wooden sailing ship with no engines and no weather forecasts, you are completely at the mercy of the sea. Storms were one of the deadliest threats pirates faced. Hurricanes in the Caribbean, nor'easters in the Atlantic, typhoons in the Pacific. These storms could appear with little warning and destroy ships in minutes. When a storm hit, all you could do was hold on and pray. The first sign of a storm was usually a change in the wind and a drop in air pressure. Experienced sailors could read these signs and prepare. They would take down the sails, secure everything on deck, and batten down the hatches, which means closing and securing all the openings below deck. But even with preparation, storms were deadly. When the storm hit, the waves would grow enormous. In a bad storm, waves could be 30 feet high or more. These walls of water would crash over the ship, flooding the deck and threatening to capsize the vessel. Everyone who was not needed to steer the ship or manage the sails would be ordered below deck. But even below deck, you are not safe. The ship would pitch and roll violently. You would be thrown around like a rag doll. You would hear the timbers creaking and groaning under the strain. And you would wonder if the next wave would be the one that broke the ship apart. The men working on deck during a storm faced even worse conditions. They would be drenched by freezing seawater. The wind would be so strong they could barely stand. The deck would be slippery and tilting at crazy angles. One wrong step and you could slide overboard and be lost to the sea forever. Ropes would whip around in the wind like weapons, capable of breaking bones or knocking you unconscious. Lightning was another danger. A ship's masts were the tallest things around, making them perfect lightning rods. If lightning struck a mast, it could split the wood, start a fire, or kill anyone nearby. Thunder was so loud it felt like the world was ending. And in the darkness of a storm, with rain pelting your face and waves crashing over you, it was easy to lose all sense of direction and fall overboard without anyone even noticing. Ships could sink in storms. Wooden ships were strong, but they were not indestructible. If a wave hit the ship at the wrong angle, it could snap the mast or crack the hull. Water would pour into the ship faster than it could be pumped out. And once a ship started sinking, there was very little time to react. Most pirates could not swim. Swimming was not a common skill in the 1700s. So if the ship went down, you went down with it. Even if you could swim, your chances of survival in the open ocean were basically zero. The water was cold. The waves were massive. You had no life jacket, no rescue boat, no way to signal for help. You would tread water for as long as you could, which would not be very long. Then you would drown, or you would die of hypothermia, or sharks would find you. Yes, sharks. The ocean was full of them, and they were attracted to struggling swimmers and blood in the water. If someone fell overboard during a battle or a storm, sharks would often appear within minutes. Tiger sharks, bull sharks, and oceanic white-tip sharks were all common in the waters where pirates operated. These sharks were aggressive and hungry, and a person in the water was an easy meal. Even in calm weather, the ocean was dangerous. Rogue waves could appear out of nowhere. These were massive waves that formed randomly and could be twice as high as the surrounding waves. A rogue wave hitting a ship could sweep men overboard, smash the deck, or even capsize the vessel. And there was no way to predict them or avoid them. You just had to hope you did not encounter one. Reefs and sandbars were another constant threat, especially in the Caribbean, where many pirates operated. The Caribbean has thousands of small islands, coral reefs, and hidden sandbars. If you hit one of these, it could rip the bottom out of your ship. Ships did not have GPS or detailed maps. Navigation was done using a compass, the stars, and dead reckoning, which means estimating your position based on speed and direction. It was incredibly easy to get lost or run aground. When a ship ran aground, it was often a death sentence. The ship would be stuck. Waves would pound it, breaking it apart piece by piece. The crew would try to lighten the ship by throwing cargo overboard, hoping to float free. But this often did not work. If the ship could not be saved, the crew would abandon it and try to reach land in small boats. But many islands in the Caribbean were uninhabited. No food, no water, no way to signal for help. Sailors would be stranded and die of thirst or starvation. The ocean was also just exhausting to deal with. The constant motion of the ship made it hard to sleep, eat, or do anything. You were always swaying, always bracing yourself. After weeks at sea, you would develop sea legs, which means your body adjusted to the constant movement. But then when you finally went ashore, you would feel like the ground was moving. It could take days to readjust. Sailors also suffered from dehydration and sun exposure. The sun reflected off the water, making it even more intense. Sunburn was constant and painful. Your skin would peel, crack, and blister. Your lips would split open. And there was no sunscreen. Some sailors would cover themselves in tar or grease to protect their skin, but this made them even hotter and more uncomfortable. So the ocean was not some romantic, beautiful backdrop for adventure. It was a hostile environment that was constantly trying to kill you. Storms, waves, reefs, sharks, sun, and the sheer vastness of the sea all conspired to make sailing one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. And pirates had chosen to spend their entire lives at sea, facing these dangers every single day. It was not bravery. It was desperation. Here is something pirate movies rarely show you. What happened when you got caught? And you probably would get caught eventually. Piracy had a very high failure rate. Most pirates were captured within a few years. And when you were captured, your fate was sealed. You were going to die. The only question was how painful it would be. By the early 1700s, European governments had had enough of piracy. It was disrupting trade and costing merchants huge amounts of money. So they started cracking down hard. Naval warships were sent out to hunt pirates. Governors in the colonies were given orders to execute pirates on sight. And new laws were passed, making piracy one of the worst crimes you could commit. Piracy was considered an act of war against all nations. This meant that pirates were not treated as regular criminals. They were treated as enemies of humanity. There was no prison time for piracy, no second chances, no mercy. If you were convicted of piracy, you were sentenced to death. Always. The execution method was hanging. But not the kind of hanging where you drop through a trapdoor and your neck breaks instantly. That was considered too merciful. Instead, pirates were subjected to a slow hanging. You would be hoisted up by a rope around your neck and left to dangle. Your neck would not break. You would slowly strangle to death over several minutes. It was agonizing. Hangings were public events. Huge crowds would gather to watch. Men, women, and children would come to see the pirates die. It was considered entertainment. Vendors would sell food and drinks. People would cheer and jeer. The whole thing was a spectacle designed to show everyone what happened to pirates and discourage others from following the same path. Before the hanging, the condemned pirates would be paraded through the streets. They would be put in chains and led past jeering crowds. Sometimes they would be forced to wear signs listing their crimes. This public humiliation was part of the punishment. The authorities wanted everyone to see that pirates were not glamorous outlaws. They were criminals who would be caught and killed. At the execution site, usually a dock or a public square, the pirates would be given a chance to make a final speech. Some used this opportunity to repent and beg for God's forgiveness. Others cursed the authorities and died defiant. And some were so drunk they could barely stand. Condemned prisoners were often given as much alcohol as they wanted before execution. It was the only mercy they would receive. One famous pirate execution was that of Captain William Kidd in London in 1701. Kidd had been a privateer, which means he had permission from the government to attack enemy ships. But he was accused of turning to piracy. Whether he was actually guilty is still debated, but it did not matter. He was convicted and sentenced to hang. On the day of his execution, the rope broke and Kidd fell to the ground, still alive. So they hanged him again. The second time, it worked. After pirates were hanged, their bodies were not buried. They were left hanging in iron cages called gibbets. These cages were placed at the entrance to harbors or along busy shipping routes. The bodies would be left to rot in the sun and rain as a warning to other sailors. Birds would pick at the corpses. The smell was horrific, but that was the point. The message was clear. This is what happens to pirates. Some bodies were hung in gibbets for years until there was nothing left but bones. Sailors passing by would see these remains and be reminded of the consequences of piracy. It was psychological warfare. The authorities wanted to make piracy seem as unappealing as possible, and seeing rotting corpses swinging in cages was certainly effective at that. One of the most famous pirates, Blackbeard, was killed in battle rather than captured and hanged. In 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy tracked Blackbeard down and engaged him in combat. The fight was brutal. Blackbeard was shot 5 times and stabbed 20 times before he finally died. Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bow of his ship as a trophy. Then he sailed back to port to collect his reward. Other pirates tried to escape execution by turning informant. They would agree to testify against their former crewmates in exchange for clemency. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes it did not. Even if you were given a pardon, your life was still ruined. Everyone knew you were a snitch. You could not go back to piracy because other pirates would kill you. And regular society did not want you either. So you would end up destitute and alone. Some governments offered pardons to pirates who agreed to give up piracy and become regular citizens. The most famous of these was the King's Pardon issued by King George I in 1717. Pirates who surrendered and swore an oath to stop pirating would be forgiven for their crimes. Thousands of pirates accepted this offer, but many of them went back to piracy anyway because they had no other way to make money. When they were caught the second time, there was no mercy. Women pirates faced the same fate as men. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were 2 famous female pirates who sailed with Calico Jack Rackham. When their ship was captured in 1720, they were sentenced to hang along with the rest of the crew. But both women were pregnant at the time of their trial. Pregnant women could not be executed under English law, so their executions were postponed. Mary Read died in prison of fever before she could be hanged. Anne Bonny's fate is unknown. Some records say her execution was postponed indefinitely. Others say Her wealthy father bought her freedom. No one knows for sure. The point is, piracy was a death sentence one way or another. Either you would die in battle, die from disease, die in a storm, or get caught and be executed. Very few pirates lived to old age. Most were dead before they turned 30, and their deaths were usually painful, public, and humiliating. The romantic image of the dashing pirate who sails off into the sunset is pure fantasy. The reality was a rope around your neck and a crowd cheering as you choked to death. Let us talk about treasure, because that is why you became a pirate, right? For the gold and jewels and buried treasure. Well, I have bad news. Most pirates never got rich. In fact, most pirates died poor. The whole idea of pirate treasure is mostly a myth. Here is how piracy actually worked financially. When a pirate crew captured a merchant ship, they would take everything of value. This included cargo like sugar, tobacco, cloth, spices, and rum. These goods could be sold at port for money. But here is the problem. Pirates could not just sail into a regular port and sell stolen goods. That would get them arrested immediately. Instead, pirates had to find shady merchants who were willing to buy stolen goods at a huge discount. These merchants knew the goods were stolen, so they would only pay a fraction of what the goods were actually worth, maybe 20 or 30 cents on the dollar. So a cargo that was worth 10,000 pounds might only get you 2,000 or 3,000 pounds when you sold it. Then that money had to be divided among the entire crew. Most pirate ships operated on a share system. The captain would get the most shares, maybe 5 or 6. Officers like the quartermaster and the sailing master would get 2 or 3 shares each. Regular crew members would get 1 share each. The cabin boys and musicians would get half a share or less. So let us do the math. Say your crew captured cargo worth 10,000 pounds. You sold it for 3,000 pounds because you had to deal with crooked merchants. That 3,000 pounds is divided among 100 crew members. The captain gets maybe 300 pounds. Regular crew members get maybe 20 or 30 pounds each. That is not a fortune. That is barely enough to live on for a few months. And remember, successful attacks were rare. You might go months without capturing anything valuable. During that time, you still had to eat and maintain the ship. So your savings would slowly disappear. By the time you finally captured another prize, you might be broke again. Pirates also had expenses. Ships needed constant repairs. Sails needed to be replaced. Ropes wore out. The hull needed to be cleaned and patched. All of this cost money. And where did that money come from? It came out of the crew's shares. So a big chunk of your earnings would go right back into maintaining the ship. When pirates did go ashore, they spent money like crazy. After months at sea eating hardtack and drinking grog, they wanted real food, real alcohol, and some fun. So they would blow all their money in a few days or weeks. Drinking, gambling, and visiting prostitutes would drain their pockets fast. And then it was back to the ship to try to capture more prizes and start the cycle over again. Actual gold and silver coins were rare. Most merchant ships carried cargo, not treasure. The Spanish treasure fleets that carried gold and silver from the New World back to Spain were heavily guarded by warships. Attacking one of these fleets was incredibly dangerous and usually ended with the pirates being killed or captured. Only the most successful pirate captains ever managed to capture a treasure ship. And even then, the treasure had to be divided among the crew. The most successful pirate in history, in terms of money, was probably Henry Avery. In 1695, he captured a ship belonging to the Grand Mughal of India. The ship was carrying gold, silver, and jewels worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. Avery's crew became incredibly wealthy overnight. But this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. And even Avery had to spend the rest of his life hiding because every government in the world wanted to catch him. Most pirates never came close to that level of success. The average pirate made about the same amount of money as a regular sailor, maybe a little more if they were lucky. And regular sailors were not well paid. It was a hard life with low wages. So piracy was not really about getting rich. It was about survival and having slightly more freedom than you would have on a merchant or naval ship. Buried treasure is also mostly a myth. There are very few verified cases of pirates actually burying treasure. Why would they? They needed money to survive. Burying it in the ground where they might never find it again made no sense. The whole idea of treasure maps with an X marking the spot is fiction created by adventure novels in the 1800s. The one famous case of buried treasure was Captain William Kidd. Before he was captured, Kidd supposedly buried some treasure on Gardiner's Island near New York. But this treasure was later recovered by authorities. So even that buried treasure did not stay buried for long. There are no other credible stories of pirates burying treasure that was never found. The reality is that most pirates died with nothing. They spent what little money they earned as soon as they got it. They had no savings, no property, no legacy to leave behind. When they died, whether from disease, violence, or execution, they left nothing but debts and bad memories. The treasure was a fantasy. The reality was poverty and death. Let us say you somehow survived being a pirate for a few years. You did not die from scurvy. You did not get killed in a fight. You did not drown in a storm, and you did not get caught and hanged. Congratulations. Now what? Where do you go? What do you do? The answer is nothing good. Once you were a pirate, you were marked for life. You could not just go back to regular society and get a normal job. Everyone would know what you had been. And no one wanted to hire a former pirate. You were a criminal. You could not be trusted. You had no references, no good reputation, nothing. Some pirates took advantage of the pardons that were occasionally offered. As mentioned earlier, King George offered a pardon in 1717. Thousands of pirates accepted. But what did they do afterward? Most had no skills other than sailing and fighting. They could not go back to being sailors on merchant ships because ship owners did not trust them. They could not go back to piracy because they had sworn an oath not to. Many former pirates ended up destitute. They would beg for money or food in port towns. Some turned to other crimes, like robbery or smuggling. Others just drank themselves to death. A few got lucky and found work as dock workers or manual laborers. But these were terrible jobs that paid almost nothing. After tasting the relative freedom of piracy, going back to being at the bottom of society was crushing. Some tried to settle down and start families. But this rarely worked out. Most pirates had no money saved. They had no home, no land, no way to support a wife and children, and their past would always catch up with them. Neighbors would find out they had been pirates and shun them. Their children would be bullied. Their wives would leave them. It was a miserable existence. The physical toll of piracy also made life after piracy difficult. Years of poor nutrition, disease, and hard labor left pirates with broken bodies. Many had lost fingers, hands, or limbs in fights or accidents. Many had scars from sword wounds or burns from gunpowder. Many were partially blind from sun damage or infections. These disabilities made it even harder to find work. Pirates also suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had seen and done terrible things. They had witnessed violence and death. They had killed people. These experiences left psychological scars that never healed. But in the 1700s, there was no concept of mental health treatment. If you were traumatized, you just had to deal with it, usually by drinking. Alcoholism was rampant among former pirates. They would drink to forget, to numb the pain, to escape the memories. But alcohol only made things worse. It destroyed their health, drained what little money they had, and made them unemployable. Many former pirates ended up dying alone in gutters, drunk and penniless. A few pirates managed to reinvent themselves. Some went to remote colonies where no one knew their past and started over. Some changed their names and lied about their history. But this required luck and careful planning. And even then, there was always the risk of being recognized. One person from your old life showing up could ruin everything. Henry Morgan is one of the few pirates who successfully transitioned to a legitimate life. He was a privateer who operated in the Caribbean in the 1660s and 1670s. He became incredibly wealthy and powerful. Eventually, he was knighted by King Charles II and became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. But Morgan was an exception, not the rule. His success was possible because he operated during a time when the line between piracy and privateering was blurry. By the early 1700s, that line had become very clear, and there was no path to legitimacy. So the life of a former pirate was almost as bad as the life of an active pirate. You had no future, no prospects, no hope. You were trapped by your past. And most former pirates did not live long after giving up piracy. They died from poverty, disease, alcoholism, or suicide. The few who survived into old age lived as outcasts, bitter and broken, telling stories of their glory days that no one wanted to hear. So where did the romantic myth of the pirate come from? Why do we have this image of dashing rogues with buried treasure and dramatic adventures? The answer is simple: fiction. The pirate myth was created by books, plays, and later movies. It has almost nothing to do with the historical reality. The pirate myth began in the early 1700s. even while real piracy was still happening. Pamphlets and books were published that told sensationalized stories of pirate exploits. These stories exaggerated the violence, glamorized the lifestyle, and invented details that never happened. One of the most influential books was A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724. This book was supposedly written by a Captain Charles Johnson, but many historians believe it was actually written by Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. This book told the stories of famous pirates like Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and Calico Jack, but it mixed fact with fiction. It included made-up dialogue, invented incidents, and turned brutal criminals into larger-than-life characters. The book was incredibly popular and shaped how people thought about pirates for the next 300 years. In the 1800s, pirate fiction became even more popular. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island in 1883. This book introduced many of the pirate tropes we know today. The treasure map with an X marking the spot, the parrot on the shoulder, the one-legged pirate with a crutch, the buried treasure. None of these were based on real piracy. They were all invented by Stevenson. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, published in 1904, gave us Captain Hook, the theatrical, melodramatic villain with the fancy coat and the hooked hand. Again, this had nothing to do with real pirates. It was pure fantasy. But it further cemented the image of pirates as colorful characters rather than desperate criminals. Hollywood took the myth even further. Starting in the 1930s and continuing to today, pirate movies have presented pirates as heroes and adventurers. Errol Flynn swinging on ropes with a sword in his teeth. Johnny Depp stumbling around drunk, but somehow always winning. These movies are fun to watch, but they are not history. They are fantasy. Real pirates did not have perfect teeth, fancy clothes, or witty one-liners. They were sick, hungry, dirty, and desperate. They smelled terrible. They lived in constant fear of death. And most of them died young and poor. There was nothing romantic about it. The real pirates were not that different from other criminals throughout history. They were people who turned to crime out of desperation or greed. Some were escaping poverty. Some were escaping the harsh discipline of the Navy. Some were just young men looking for adventure and not understanding what they were getting into. But once they became pirates, they were trapped. There was no easy way out. The golden age of piracy lasted only about 80 years, from 1650 to 1730. During that time, thousands of men and a few women turned to piracy. Most of them died within a few years. By the 1730s, piracy had been largely stamped out by naval patrols and harsh punishments. The few remaining pirates either accepted pardons or were hunted down and killed. Piracy did not end completely. It still exists today in places like Somalia and the South China Sea, but modern piracy has nothing in common with the pirates of the 1700s. Modern pirates use machine guns and speedboats, not swords and sailing ships. And they face modern law enforcement, not wooden warships. The historical pirates left almost nothing behind. A few ships have been found and excavated by archaeologists. Some documents and trial records survive. But most pirates were illiterate and left no written accounts of their lives. What we know about them comes from court records, newspaper reports, and books written by people who never met them. So the myth of the pirate is powerful and enduring. It appeals to our desire for freedom and adventure. But it is important to separate myth from reality. Real piracy was not an adventure. It was a desperate, dangerous, and mostly boring way to live. And it almost always ended badly. So here we are at the end of our journey. We have covered everything. The terrible food, the disgusting living conditions, the endless boredom, the diseases, the violence, the storms, the executions, the poverty, the myth versus the reality. And if you have made it this far, you now understand something important. Being a pirate was not glamorous. It was not exciting. It was mostly boring and gross. Let us review what a typical day as a pirate actually looked like. You woke up in a damp hammock surrounded by rats. You ate weevil-infested hardtack for breakfast. You used a plank over the ocean as a toilet, risking your life every time. You wore the same rotting, lice-infested clothes every day. You spent hours doing nothing while the ship slowly moved across the ocean. You got sick from contaminated water and poor nutrition. You lived in constant fear of storms, disease, violence, and capture. And you did all of this for very little money. The occasional excitement of a pirate attack did not make up for the months of misery in between. And those attacks were terrifying and dangerous. You could be killed or injured. And even if you survived, the psychological trauma would stay with you forever. Most pirates died before they turned 30. They died from disease, violence, storms, or execution. Very few lived to old age, and the ones who did survive had broken bodies and traumatized minds. They ended up poor, alone, and forgotten. So why did people become pirates? Some had no choice. They were pressed into service or recruited by force. Others were escaping even worse conditions. Life as a sailor in the Navy or on a merchant ship was also terrible. You were beaten, poorly paid, and worked like a slave. At least as a pirate, you had a vote in how the ship was run. You had a share of the profits, small as they were, and you had a sense of brotherhood with your crew. Pirates did have a democratic system that was unusual for the time. The crew voted on major decisions. They elected their captain and could remove him if they were unhappy. They divided the loot fairly according to the share system, and they had rules that everyone followed. If you broke the rules, you faced punishment. But at least the rules applied to everyone, including the captain. This was different from the Navy, where officers had absolute power and could punish sailors for any reason or no reason at all. In that sense, pirate ships were more democratic and fair than naval ships. But that does not mean life as a pirate was good. It just means it was slightly less terrible than the alternatives. Pirates were not heroes. They were not noble outlaws fighting against tyranny. They were criminals who stole from others to survive. They used violence and intimidation to get what they wanted. Many of them were cruel and sadistic. They killed innocent people. They destroyed lives. And they did all of this knowing that they would probably die young and horribly. But they were also human beings. They were products of their time and circumstances. They lived in an era when life was cheap, violence was common, and opportunities were limited. They made choices based on the options available to them, and those choices usually led to suffering and death. The romantic myth of the pirate does a disservice to history. It turns brutal criminals into heroes. It glamorizes violence and theft. And it ignores the reality of what life was actually like for these men and women. They were not swashbuckling adventurers. They were desperate people living desperate lives. So the next time you watch a pirate movie or read a pirate adventure novel, remember what you learned here. Real piracy was nothing like that. It was dirty, dangerous, boring, and almost always ended in death. The treasure was a lie. The adventure was a myth. The reality was hardtack, disease, and a rope around your neck. Now maybe take a moment to appreciate your life. You have clean water to drink, fresh food to eat, a comfortable bed to sleep in, a private bathroom, medical care when you get sick, laws that protect you, a future to look forward to. You are not trapped on a wooden ship with 100 smelly men, eating bugs and waiting to die. The pirates of the 1700s would have given anything to trade places with you. They would have looked at your life and thought it was paradise. Indoor plumbing alone would have blown their minds. So maybe think about that the next time you complain about your job or your commute or your Wi-Fi being slow. Being a pirate was mostly boring and gross. It was not romantic. It was not fun. It was survival in the worst possible conditions. And it almost always ended badly. That is the truth that history books and pirate movies do not tell you. But now you know. And knowing the truth makes those adventure stories a lot less appealing, does not it? So remember the real pirates, not the ones from movies and books, but the real men and women who lived this miserable life. They died so we could learn from their mistakes. They suffered so we could appreciate what we have. And they showed us that sometimes the things that look exciting from a distance are actually terrible up close. The golden age of piracy ended 300 years ago, but the myth lives on, and maybe that is okay. Maybe we need myths and stories to make life more interesting, but we also need to know the truth. We need to understand what really happened, because history is not just about what we wish had happened. It is about what actually happened. And what actually happened to pirates was mostly boring, gross, and tragic. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unglamorous reality of pirate life. I hope you learned something. I hope you appreciate your modern conveniences a little more. And I hope the next time someone says they want to be a pirate, you tell them exactly why that is a terrible idea. Until next time, stay clean, stay healthy, and be grateful you live in an era with antibiotics and indoor plumbing. Because compared to the 1700s, we are all living like kings.